out today and speaking to us. We actually have an opportunity now to ask questions of speakers. I think you probably want to ask John questions more than so anybody have any questions to ask?
And by the way, just to help our last speaker out, I'm going to create a new creationist. Dr. Ika, would you like to come out here? Diane has been a lecturer in medical biology at Canberra University. I asked her to come down and just be my backup in case you got too heavy.
So we had a question up the back.
2 out of 3. Yes.
You made the point that if a scientist was able to artificially create DNA, which resulted in a life form, that would be proof of creationism, because if it was created the second time, it must have been created the first time.
Yeah, it would be logically consistent, yes.
Well, but how do you substantiate that? I mean, just because something has happened in an obviously creationist way at one point, because of everything that is possible, how does that automatically...
Here's what you normally do to call something a proof in biology or geology or whatever. You take your starting point and say, if this is true, if it is true that God created finches to produce their own kind, then given long enough, finches would turn into some kind of finches. Whether they're South American or Galactic, it wouldn't matter. Time becomes irrelevant. The end product would be recognisably some kind of finch. So when you get to testing your conclusion, you regard that as a proof. If it is true that God used his pre-existing intelligence to create the code, then A, the code should have the properties that are only found in all created codes, and B, if you want to make a copy of it, you will have to play God. You will have to create a copy of it by using your outside intelligence that exists before it, so it's a logically consistent consequence, which is otherwise known as proof.
Just to interrupt quickly, I've just got a few attendance forms I'm going to pass around so we can get some funding and support and grants from...
While they're starting that off, if you want to follow anything up, you will find there's brochures outside the door on antibiotic resistance, or the blue one on the general argument for evolution, a bit more than 18 minutes.
And anybody who is interested in signing up to our club options can do so at the front, right next on the green.
The kind of doctrine of Christian evolution teaches that it is possible for a God or Christian God to exist and have created the, life forms of life while evolution still continues. So God can look over the evolutionary process. It seems like you're creating a false distinction between godly creation and godless evolution.
Yes, I appreciate the concept. When I first left university, I didn't become a Christian until well after I left, a creationist till well after I left university. I wasn't the guy putting his hand up every time asking questions. I was cautiously listening to the others do that. But the reality is, I first thought, well, why don't we just say God used millions of years of evolution? And then I had to ask, which God am I talking about? And you refer to the Christian God, and I'm a Christian, I make no apologies for that. So you have to ask what the Christian God is like, particularly when you read through the Christian New Testament that says God has stamped his nature on the creation. And then you go back and you read Genesis where it says, God saw all that he made and it was very good. Read the chapter, there's no death, there's no destruction, there's no struggle to survive, there's no kill or be killed. That all came after man rebelled. So you will find any Christian who says, hey, God used millions of years of death and struggle and chaos and murder and called it very good. Sorry, it's not the Christian God. It's one you've invented.
Jay,
Okay, so basically, what the one big point that I thought that the negative made was that this point of irreducible complexity and this idea that, like, I guess if you're going to say that this is a really complex system and we need something complex to create it, that means you're making something more complex than that which we're already trying to explain, which is basically a cop-out, because what it means is that you're saying, well, I don't understand this, so I'm going to make something that I understand even less, which is actually infinitely complex, right? How do you justify your belief that an infinitely complex being, or if not infinitely, like more complex than that which we're trying to explain, how do you justify your belief in that?
Okay, well, first of all, since they videoed this, you will re-watch the video and notice that not once did I use that argument.
They did, and I'm asking a response to it.
Okay. Basically, when he said, you need to account for a creator, and that must be more complex, and he must have been created by something more complex, you end up with an infinite logical cycle, which sounds philosophically valid. Until you say, okay, what is God like? How would I know? Or simpler, what's a creator like? Because we know what creation is. You see, this didn't happen by itself. I want you to imagine I'm the person that existed before this. I used my intelligence. I took metal that doesn't do lectins. I took electric cords that don't actually make power. I put it all together, and there it is. I existed before it. I'm not a part of it. I'm smarter than it. It depends on me. I don't depend on it. Give me an axe, I'll prove it. Smash, smash, right? Now, here's the philosophical application. What's the relationship between me, the creator, and this, the creation? Answer, I existed before it. I'm actually outside every parameter of that creation. It's totally dependent on me, the creator. Now go to Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens, space. He's outside of space.
So what created God?
Sorry, the question doesn't apply. And God created earth, matter. How heavy is it? It doesn't apply. He's outside of that parameter. He invented time. How old is he? Sorry, he doesn't have a start, he doesn't have a finish. Now that's the philosophical logic, but the reality is the God of the Bible said, I am from eternity to eternity. There's his answer stated. In other words, he's been totally logically consistent with any philosophy. You can work backwards from your relationship to a creator, so it's not a continual series that never has an end.
Me again? Oh, thank you. Sorry, maybe a petty question, but God does not have properties of time, mass, or anything like that, but he does have a gender?
As revealed, the answer is, even in the first paragraph of Genesis, Bereshith bara Elohim, it's a male singular noun with a plural ending. Right? So just like the French have female chairs or female, you know how the French do that and English don't? Well, Hebrew does it for words too, so it is definitely a male sex word, gender. In terms of sex, gender and sex may not mean the same thing in God's perspective. But when Jesus comes, of course, he says, you want to learn how to pray? Here's how you pray, our Father. He never says our Mother. Right, so it's consistent all the way through. Who am I to disagree?
This is meant to be a scientific debate, as I understand it. What direct evidence do you have that God exists? If he's the creator of everything, and that's the crux of your argument, what direct evidence do you have?
Okay,
And I don't mean a book written by
No. Well, the reality is that book is interesting because there's a whole section there where it says God wrote with his own hand and handed Moses two
What direct
tablets.
evidence do you have?
Okay.
We can measure science. We can do, like you said, we can do that in the lab. What evidence do you have?
Well,
that
if you do
anybody
measure
can
science, you ended up with as many holes as he's got. So faith basis.
At least there's some evidence. I'd like to
Okay.
say a single shred of direct evidence.
Okay, who do you think Jesus Christ was?
Doesn't exist right now, so it's not direct evidence.
Oh, no, that's where you disagree. You see, one of the reasons I became a Christian was having picked up the Bible and read from Genesis 1 all the way through to the New Testament. In John's Gospel, chapter 14, it says, if you love me and if you obey my commandments, I will, present tense, make myself known to you.
So, have you answered
Sorry, we'll
questions?
just get everyone to the next person.
In other words, you ask for specific testable evidence, and one reason I've stayed a Christian is that, I actually do know my own Saviour. So feel free to read John chapter 14. It's a most illuminating chapter.
I've got a question. So I would come, I'm a Christian. I also happen to believe that God used the evolutionary process to bring about life. This question is actually for the debating team, if that's all right.
Great.
And the question is this. I think you used an argument, I think it's been proposed by Dawkins and others, that this whole idea that somehow we can infer from complexity of function or the ability to do complex things, that being or that object itself must be complex. So if God can create a complex world, God must be more complex. I guess I want to know how you make that inference.
Well, the interesting thing is, you kind of have to if you read the Bible. Here's something that's created time, space, earth. If you believe in a creator, you believe in something that understands it, the same way that John Mackay has to understand a lectern to create it. And if you believe that information is the measure of that complexity, as he appears to do in his speech, then you have to believe that. You have to believe in a creator complex enough, maybe not infinitely complex, though the Bible claims it in various ways, but at least complex enough to understand his creation. And if your problem with that creation, that thing arising naturally through evolution, is its complexity, then you have the exact same problem with a being that supposedly understands that complexity, a being that can create it. And so that's inherent in the system. Personally, I don't believe in a God. I don't have that problem. But you do have that problem as soon as you try and believe in one that understands it. You might be able to resolve that, but not in a way that's necessarily logical.
Okay, please follow up on that.
Can I just throw in a comment on that? Because you've both used the term complexity, and I do have a caution with that because I've seen the painting blue poles, right? Blue poles is a very complex, but not what you'd call traditional art form. But then if you take a matchstick, the matchstick may not be as complex as blue pole, but nobody believes matchsticks happen by themselves, even just the mere act of dipping one in a bit of phosphorus mix. So complexity is not the issue. The issue is, was it created? In other words, you would recognise properties that do not come from the stuff that you are making the match of. Matchsticks do not dip themselves in phosphorus. Somebody existed before it. So complexity is irrelevant, really.
We're going to have time for one more, so.
Yeah, I was going to say this. I am a Christian, and a fairly serious Christian at that. But this idea that you should take the Old Testament absolutely literally seems to be out of line, as Gemma said, with most Christian thinking. Because if you look at Genesis, there are two Genesis stories. There are two stories of creation which contradict each other, meaning they can't both be literally true. And there are things like people living to 1,000 years old. And so a lot of biblical scholarship actually says this stuff shouldn't be read literally, but should be read symbolically. And it's not just me saying this, but it's people like St. Augustine, one of the early fathers of the church, and then people like John Edward Newman, and even modern Christian debaters like William Lane Craig and Peter Creech, all agree that these stories should not be taken absolutely literally, but should be taken figuratively. So why do you think it is that you are so different to so many other Christian scholars?
Okay, if St. Augustine or Mr. Lane Craig had died on a cross for me, I'd be interested in their opinion. But since it was Jesus Christ who did, here's how he uses the Old Testament. You see, the Pharisees came and said, what do you teach about divorce? And he said, haven't you read, back in the beginning God made them male and female, therefore a man will take a wife from what God has put together, let not man put asunder. The relevance, there's two half quotes there from chapter 1 and chapter 2. And who was he arguing with? The religious lawyers of the day who spoke more Hebrew than you and I put together. And not one bit did they object. Because in English, yes, A follows B, B follows A, C follows, but in Hebrew, sorry, they're two sides of the same coin. If they'd have been contradictory chapters, those religious lawyers would have torn Jesus to pieces. But they just let it go, because in Hebrew, you will find, hey, here's the first account, here's the second account, and they do that. And if you're looking for evidence Moses grew up in Egypt, there it is. Go and read the stele of Tutmosis III, and you'll find that Tutmosis III on his stele says, I did this, and 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 I did this. And on this side, all about how and why. Moses went to school in Egypt.